the end of the next session. But the issue is that, if I can abuse my role as moderator for 1 minute, if there is strategic silence in Turkish opposition, I think there is strategic caution in European circles right now, because they are cautious about the results. They are cautious about opposition being able to derail Turkish democracy, and they're very cautious about possible Turkish realignment when it comes to foreign and security policy. So I think we need to find a way, if this happens, and as I said, I will come back to this, that how can this both strategic silence and strategic caution could be overcome, so that there's a more fruitful relationship between Turkey and the West. Seren, I want to come back to you with a really short question. On the second scenario, possibly contested election, possibility of electoral fraud and doubts over freeness and fairness of the election. What could the West do to help? Is there anything that the Europeans and the Americans maybe do to help somehow, or this is going to be rather a debate on the ground in the country rather?
Thank you, Ike. Actually, I got these questions before the elections so much, and also our friends in Western countries also asking questions like that. Should Western countries issue some documents to warn Turkey to ensure a free and fair elections? Actually, these kinds of warnings before the elections, pre-elections time, mainly used by the government to target the opposition, because their main framework, their main discourse is based on the targeting opposition parties and using some kinds of discourse which targets also foreign countries by allying with the oppositions to overthrow the Erdoğan. So since they really use for these kinds of arguments for their own sake before the election, I think it was a little bit risky to warn Turkey, I think. But during the elections or after the elections, still there are so many concerns about holding free and fair elections in Turkey. First of all, in Turkey, even the election day, there won't be anything regarding the electoral security. We can see the scenes that the government use a very harsh tone and targets the opposition, and the opposition actors was stoned in some cities. Also, the playing field for the opposition is uneven, so that just before the election day, there were so many disadvantage issues for the opposition, which does not make this election free and fair. And then during the election day, there are so many concerns. First of all, generally, I heard from the abroad that maybe Erdoğan will not accept the election results as any other leaders. If the margin is low between two candidates, I think the government may do the same thing that they did in the 2019 elections, in the local elections. But I'm not sure that it will work, because Turkish people are, even if they voted for the government, they have sensitivities to free and fair elections, so that it won't maybe work for the benefit of the government. And if the margin is low, but it's certain that the opposition win the elections, maybe the Western countries send their concerns about the legitimation of the new government, so that it will ensure that Turkey will have a transition to power. So the legitimation of the new government is important if everything is ensured by the independent committees in Turkey. But if the margin is high, I think the possibility of not accepting the election results by Erdoğan is not so high. Even if his supporters will be in the streets, like we have seen in the case of Brazil and in the US, as populist, as supporters of populist parties. I think this is not a high possibility for Turkey, because still we have a democratic tradition. I hope what I say will not be false after the elections, but I can understand all of the hesitations, because the aura towards the elections are very polarized. And nowadays, all of the discussions in Turkish politics are polarizing by the, especially in the side of the government. That's why we get so many concerns, and we in Turkey, people have so many concerns about these kinds of electoral fraud. But I think the most important issue again is holding democratic elections, so that I think we should also see in Turkey positive signals from the West regarding that issue.
Thank you very much. So what your suggestion is, in a nutshell, is sit tight, trust Turkish democratic resilience until the election day, and on the election day, if there is a new government, quickly legitimize its win, so that you can start working together. I'm sure European decision makers are taking notes. I want to pose you one question, Sinem. What is the conversation in Berlin at this moment? What is the feeling in the biggest member state of Germany, the EU, the biggest member state, Germany, about a possible continuation of status quo, and what kind of policies should follow if that is the case?
Thank you, Ilke. I'll be very short. I think in general, everyone is waiting for the election day to see what is going to happen. But I also observe, not only in Germany, but also in general in the West, there is a change in tone for a week or more towards, basically, I think up until recently, the general consensus was that the current ruling alliance will stay in power. It looks like that consensus is now broken, that there is more, people are more open to entertaining the possibility of an opposition win. Now, what happens if the current ruling alliance remains in power, which is your question, and what should Germany do? As I said in the first round, I think it is a fact that if the current ruling alliance remains in power, Turkey is going to continue on a quite unstable path. It is going to be authoritarian, but that authoritarianism is not going to be stabilized for various reasons. Put everything aside, because Turkey lacks, luckily, natural resources. So economic resources will be an issue, and it will basically hinder the ruling alliance from stabilizing its authoritarian rule. That means that it will be quite fragile, and it will basically the confrontational tone in foreign policy will continue, and it will not be predictable. So I think German government, but also the European governments in general, should prepare themselves for that. And against that backdrop, three issues are, I think, important. One is that any European government, including the German government, should basically be, I think, very clear about areas of conflict, areas of cooperation, and the red lines when it comes to, because it's obviously unimaginable that working together with the Turkish government will stop. It won't, mainly because of the multi-tiered relations, the historically long relations, etc., etc. But it would be, I think, even more important to be very clear about those red lines, because we witnessed in the past that the lack of clarity about red lines was a problem. And linking it back to what Seren was saying, I think it's really important also to function with the medical principle of do not harm. That means do not provide legitimacy to the ruling alliance, even if you basically have to continue working with the ruling alliance, etc., in certain files. That doesn't necessarily mean that the kind of legitimacy should be provided. So I think that would be the three pillars, or the three issues that I would emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I can pass the floor to Zach, so we can dig in a bit more on the other dimensions of foreign policy.
Thanks, Itke. And Evren, let me come to you now and talk a little bit
Sure.
about Turkey's relationship with Russia. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering, in your perspective, to what extent a friendly relationship between Russia and Turkey will continue after the election, irrespective of the results. So could you help our audience understand a little bit what the existing structural dependencies are in the Russo-Turkish
Sure.
relationship? And beyond that, could you also perhaps provide a perspective on whether friendly relations between Turkey and Russia are a strategic risk for the European Union, or whether, to an extent, they represent a strategic opportunity?
Okay.
Is it beneficial for Western countries to have a bridge between East and West, as it were, within its own ranks?
Okay. Let me start by underlining the fact that if the opposition wins, the Turkey's Russian foreign policy, or the bilateral relations between Russia and Turkey, is going to be significantly, radically different. Or maybe I'll pose this as a question, whether it's going to be significantly or radically different from what we have been experiencing in the last 5-6 years. I think I am going to be answering this question as partially yes, because there are some structural problems that the opposition is going to be inheriting from the last 6 years. But again, let me underline the fact that if the opposition wins, this is going to be Turkey's return to the West moment. It definitely is going to be like that. But the Turkey is not going to be returning to the West, as I said previously, like it did 20 years ago. This is going to be something, again, very different from what we have experienced previously. One more thing that I would like to underline, even though the opposition's Russia policy is going to be different than the current government's policy, they do share something common, I think, and it's the concept of strategic autonomy. It has not been that emphasized or underlined, but you do see that this concept in the texts that the opposition has produced, or in the conversations, dialogues that the opposition has with the foreign ministers, and this and that. But how you basically exercise the concept of strategic autonomy is also different from how the government is actually right now exercising it. Because the concept of strategic autonomy is not just for Turkey. I mean, most of the European governments are also using this concept. Okay. These are some important points that I would like to mention, but let me say a couple of other points with regard to Turkish-Russian relations and what we could expect in the upcoming days after the elections. First of all, Turkish-Russian relations has a very strong economic rationale right now. I mean, and it's not easy for the opposition and for the government to let go of that sort of relationship, given that the top priority of post-electoral process is going to be the recovery of the economy, either for the opposition or for the government. And Turkey cannot forego Russian energy in the short term. And this is true for the government as well, for the opposition too. Turkey's energy dependency to Russia is a legacy of the last 20 years. Gazprom basically provides 45% of Turkey's domestic gas demand. Almost 50% of Turkey's gas demand is basically covered by Russia. So there is Akkuyu, opposition's policy, nuclear central. Opposition's policy in that could be different. There will be some variations, but there is this huge dependency and legacy where it's not easy to transform in a very short period of time, even in medium term. But again, opposition basically underlines the fact that and shares with the government this idea of transforming Turkey into an energy hub. And I do think that possibility is more if the opposition wins, because that possibility requires diversification of existing routes and supplies. It also requires political will of the potential parties, right? And you need the European will to collaborate with with Turkey. And if the opposition wins, then you'll have much more potential to transform Turkey into a hub, either through Azerbaijani gas, and also there are opportunities, will be more opportunities in the East Med and so on and so forth. I mean, I can talk about this a lot more, but let me stop here. So there's this energy issue, which either for the opposition or for the government, not easy to tackle. And the second issue is that foreign policy coordination, which is going to be a legacy of the last 10 years again. Turkey and Russia has developed a lot of policy coordination in many areas, specifically in Syria. And opposition is basically arguing that they will be looking for a compromise solution or with some sort of a resolution with the Bashar Assad regime, and to facilitate Syrian refugees to return. And in order to do that, you also need to include Russians and have sort of a dialogue with the Russians. So I, again, do think that it won't be easy for the opposition to let go of the Russian connection. What would be different is, I think, probably this is also included in the political program of the opposition. There is going to be a difference in terms of how the opposition is going to be handling S-400s issue, which become a major impediment in Turkey's relations specifically with the US, but also with NATO and EU as well. We will see what types of policy resolutions that the opposition is going to come up with. But I do think that the policy of, like arms transfer, weapons purchases is definitely going to be difficult, and it's not easy for either opposition or government, given that I mean, in the context of Russian invasion of Ukraine. So let me stop here. I mean, there will be continuities, of course, based on the legacy of the past, but there will be differences, and that differences is going to be also included in how the dialogue between Russia and Turkey is gonna handled. It's not going to be personal, put into Erdoğan sort of relationship. We'll see broadly we will be seeing a more switch to an institutionalized way of dealing with foreign policy issues. I talked a bit long this time, but let me stop here.
Well, thanks very much. And there's a lot to unpack there for sure. But in the interest of time, let me turn to Sinem, given what you raised, evident just now, about the notion of Turkish strategic autonomy. And Sinem, you've written before for SEPS on Turkey's Eurasian and pan-Turkic ambitions. I'm wondering whether, in your view, you believe that this vector or this facet of Turkish foreign policy will be further developed in the event of an opposition victory. And given the connectivity opportunities and the chance to work with a government that is perhaps more committed to EU norms and standards, I'm wondering whether that facet of a strategically autonomous, independent, non-Western looking Turkish foreign policy is something that the EU should even encourage and perhaps even help to develop in the event of a change in power in Turkey.
Thank you, Zach. I agree with Evren that definitely the aspiration for strategic autonomy is there to stay. And actually, it is something that hasn't started with the current government. That goes back to the post-Cold War era, that you can trace it back to Özal, you can trace it back to Demirel, you can trace it back to even Ismail Cem, right? And the idea is that given the opportunities that were made available in the post-Cold War era, Turkey basically used and saw its cultural, linguistic, and religious ties with its neighboring countries and in its neighboring regions as a strategic asset to position itself as a bridge at that time between the West and the East. And at the moment, we call it to position itself as a regional power. So that aspiration will remain, definitely, that will not change. But what will change, again, is totally in agreement with Evren, is that an opposition-led government will be acting in good faith. And that is tremendously important. We'll be acting in good faith because the foreign policy will be institutionalized. We'll be acting in good faith. The foreign policy basically will not have a confrontational discourse, will be acting in good faith because it strategically sees itself, and it keeps repeating it strategically sees Turkey's position within the Western security architecture. Now, the question becomes actually, I think, when it comes to Turkey's relations with the West, and particularly Europe, where will Europeans see Turkey in a changing European security order? I think given basically the changing both the form, but also kind of to a certain extent, the content of the foreign policy, there will be definitely a bigger space for negotiations and compromise between Turkey and its Western allies. That being said, I think that basically means, going back to your question and finishing up, there will definitely be, I think, opportunities under an opposition-led government for more predictable and institutional cooperation with the EU in different policy realms when it comes to be it the energy, be it the supply chains, etc., etc. And the geopolitical moment is also fruitful for that. So I think an opposition-led government will, yes, definitely will provide more opportunities for a fruitful cooperation.
Excellent. Now, before I turn back to Ilke, we just have a couple of audience questions, and in the interest of time, let me just turn to them very quickly. One is a very important question about how to pronounce the name of Erdogan's opponent, which of course is a very important thing for people in the West to learn how to do. Now, I don't speak any Turkish at all, but maybe my co-panelists can correct me here. That Kılıçdaroğlu is as close as it gets. So two Turkish I's, which is sort of like a glottal schwa, a C with a cedilla, and then a G with an upside down hat, which silences it or turns it into some sort of a Y sound. If that's correct, that's my guess. Just there we go. And then a question from Alexander Karapiperis, who is an emerging market analyst. His question is directed specifically at Sinem, but if anyone else wants to tackle it, just raise your hand, which is, assuming that the Nation Alliance of KK wins the presidential election, but loses the opportunity to form a majority in parliament, and if there is a difficult transition of power as well in that context, given 22 years of the Erdogan apparatus being built up amongst the bureaucracy and the levers of power, how is it going to be, or how possible is it going to be, rather, for a diverse six-party coalition to apply a painful economic stability program in particular? So I don't know if Sinem, you want to tackle that, or if anyone else has any strong opinions on that.
Thank you. It is possible, just judging on the basis of what they say. It is definitely possible. Whether implementing that program will cost the election, for instance, will cost the opposition the local elections in 2024, or will basically kind of lead the opposition to a kind of break or a rupture, those are different questions. It might, because obviously it will be very hard. But I think one should keep in mind that regardless of who will be sitting in the government, the economic repercussions on society are going to be hard, even if Mr. Erdogan stays in power. We are already seeing it. Income inequality is high. People are becoming poorer and poorer by the day. Prices are increasing on a daily basis. Turkish citizens are hoarding gold because they are not sure of tomorrow, etc., etc. So even if the current government continues, I think economically the country is going to be in a bad situation. Now, I think for the opposition, again, that basically to say that it is definitely a daunting task. But that needs to be explained well to the population, I think, and that's something that the opposition really needs to very strategically work on in terms of explaining the consequences of that economic program to the population. And second, I think Turkey's Western allies should also help when it comes to economic aid, etc. And already, as far as I can follow, there are conversations between the opposition and actors in the West towards that direction. So definitely an opposition-led government will be turning to Turkey's Western allies for financing and funding. And that also means actually that might have positive repercussions on foreign policy ground as well, because financing from the West means that an opposition government, even if it might have the same threat perceptions, for instance, will have to prioritize reorder its priorities. So that means that, again, I think more room for compromise and negotiation, better negotiations with its Western allies. But just one final point, and this is kind of like being a devil's advocate to my own self, because there is an emphasis on the construction sector in the question. Definitely post-Erdoğan era will not be anti-Erdoğan era. There are a lot of vested interest, and that goes also to the question of Jens Bastian about foreign economic policy. Those vested interests are there to stay, so the opposition needs to basically find a way to work with them, work around them. Thank you.
May I jump in and add something
Please.
to what Sinem said? I think one of the legacies of the last decade or so, or the presidential system for the opposition is going to be, this is an executive-centered system. So for the opposition to transfer power to the parliament requires parliamentary majority, of course. All these major constitutional changes requires parliamentary majority. This is something that the opposition promised to deliver. But if not, in terms of the economy, all other questions, what the Erdoğan government created by switching to presidentialism in 2018 is an executive-oriented system. So I do think that, okay, you need parliamentary approval for some things, but there are also, I mean, decree power that the executive has right now. So all these unintended consequences that the opposition is going to be basically inheriting from the previous regime is going to empower the opposition, at least in the short and medium term, up until they deliver their promise to switch to the parliamentarism. So it's basically sort of what the opposition basically criticizing right now could be used in the advantage of transforming Turkey's economy, institutions, and this and that if there is no parliamentary majority.
Excellent. Thanks very much. İlke, back over to you. In addition to helping our audience with Turkish phonetics, perhaps you can give us some takeaways on what we should be looking at going forward.
Exactly. So just answering also from the Turkish side, it's Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and it might be the time to start pronouncing the name, even if it's a tough one. I'm very grateful for all the comments that you have already introduced in this webinar. And just like moving forward, I have one key question that I will be posing to all of you, because this discussion about the strategic autonomy, what will change and what will remain the same in Turkish foreign policy, and what are the grounds for better cooperation between Turkey and the EU are critical. And these are the questions that are always being asked in all the circles in Brussels and EU member states, and I assume in Washington, DC as well. So being very, very, very articulate, what are the 3 things that the Western actors should do? 3 things, short term, from day after to month 3, for example, the Western actors should do in case of an opposition victory and democratic transition of power in Turkey. What they should do, what are the policy areas that they should work on, what kind of priorities should be on the table, assuming that revailing relations with Turkey is also in their best interests. Let's start with Seren this time.
Well, actually, first, increasing dialogue will be important. Secondly, positive agenda towards Turkey if the government change is important, because there will be an effort for the redemocratization and reinstitutionalization. And also economic support, as I think Sinem mentioned, will be important for Turkey-EU relations. I would like to briefly mention an important issue related to Turkey's EU relations. First of all, early steps of Turkish foreign policy and early steps of the new government basically will help to increase this dialogue. First of all, there will be redemocratization efforts, but also for implementing outstanding European Court of Human Rights decisions, I think, will be an important sign on behalf of Turkey, and also ensuring steps for freedom of expression, freedom of media. This will come immediately after the elections, depends on the opposition, and also ensuring also steps to ensure independency of the central bank and also reorganization of the economic institutions in Turkey will be important steps on behalf of Turkey. That's why these early steps should help EU to rethink their approach to Turkey and consider them and increase dialogue, because this increased dialogue and multilateral and initiating again multilateral relations will be important. And also not only the EU, but the transatlantic allies should be well prepared for the change, but also again returning to institutional based relations rather than personal based relations.
As all the people in this room know, that I like this idea of reinstitutionalization of EU-Turkey relations very much. So I'm sure there will be more work on that. Sinem, I'm going to pose you the same question. Seren said dialogue, positive agenda, and economic support. But while passing the floor to you, I also want to add one more point, because one of the biggest criticisms of fares that we are hearing in some European circles right now is that Turkish government, Turkish opposition becoming the new government, and while re-establishing relations with the EU, reclaiming its accession bid. And many in the West see this as a problem, because right now the European Union already has a very, very high momentum in the enlargement policy. It has given Ukraine, Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina candidacy status in last year already, opened up accession negotiations with 2 countries from the Western Balkans, and right now basically trying to figure out what is next. So enlargement policy itself, even without Turkey, is quite on the move and already moving forward with many questions of its own. So what would be the case if there's an opposition government in Turkey, and what would be the implications for the European governments if Turkish opposition's plan includes reclaiming its enlargement bid as well?
Thank you, Ilke. According to the, I'm going to call it a coalition text, this long text that the opposition, the alliance of 6, table of 6 published, according to that document, EU membership is a strategic priority for the opposition. Now, whether that happens or not, that's a separate question. But as far as the EU is concerned, I think one thing to learn from the last 20 to 25 years is to be clear and honest about how the EU sees Turkey as a member, as a partner, as a privileged partner, strategic partner, etc., etc. So I think, and that goes back to what Seren was saying, trust needs to be repaired in the relations after 20 years, but that requires 2. So I think from both sides, there needs to be goodwill and the capacity and kind of demonstration to act in good faith. Therefore, if the EU tells Turkey, okay, if we accept you as a member, that's going to basically increase our own burden and costs. We cannot, basically, so the EU should be, I think, really honest about how it sees Turkey. So that's what I would say. And just I basically agree with everything Seren says, but I just want to add regarding your question about the possible areas of cooperation. I could see, obviously, security, because of the situation in Ukraine, the war, economic cooperation, and against the backdrop of the Green Deal and climate change. And last but not least, regional cooperation, because basically Turkish investments and Turkish defense cooperation agreements, Turkish exports in the Middle East, Africa, etc., they are not going to go anywhere. They are going to be there. So these links that were established in Turkey's neighborhood, larger neighborhood, might be useful in terms of EU-Turkey relations under an opposition-led government in Turkey. So those are the 3 areas that I could see that where there might be some progress when it comes to EU-Turkey relations. Thank you.
And that's very, very helpful. You know, security, regional cooperation, and using Turkish connections in the region and beyond for improving EU's relations with these regions, and economic cooperation under the light of Green Deal. They are definitely very clear cooperation areas. Evren, last but not least, what should the Europeans do? What should the Americans do to help? Because it is also a very good time for transatlantic policy cooperation when it comes to Turkey. What would be your suggestions for the European leaders and also for those sitting in on the other side of the Atlantic?
Okay. First of all, let me say three things that could be shared by both the Americans and the Europeans. The first one is, and the most short-term thing that both the Europeans and Americans could do, is the expression of interest in finding new or renewed ways for communication with Turkey. The second thing is, like, maybe this could be just a phone conversation or an official visit, something like that, right? That shows the goodwill and willingness to communicate with the Turkey. The second thing is inclusion of Turkey in various platforms that Turkey previously excluded, not just Turkey, but the Erdoğan government previously excluded. For example, the Summit for Democracy, inviting Turkey to the Summit for Democracy, or any other platforms that Turkey wasn't included. The third one is that there needs to be more foreign policy coordination, as Seren and Sina has been emphasizing, and specifically for Syria and Mediterranean, which really creates huge problems between Turkey and the EU. And for Syria, between the United States and Turkey, there needs to be more dialogue and policy coordination. Specifically for the US, moving ahead with the F-16 deal is going to help a lot, and also being willing to open a dialogue to re-include Turkey in the F-35 deal is also going to be helpful. For the EU, specifically customs union, renegotiating, updating customs union, visa liberalization that Kılıçdaroğlu promised is going to definitely help opposition to deliver one of its promises, and also being open to renegotiate the migration deal, which is actually not working anymore for both sides. I mean, Turkey should be ready to basically go over its flexible visa policy, and also EU should be open to renegotiate the terms of the deal. This is something that the opposition also promised to deliver. So these are the major issue areas, I would say, that could improvements could be done.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, but I can see that we have lots of ideas on the table in case of an opposition win, in case of a transition, democratic transition in Turkey. There is definitely enough agenda for the Europeans and the Americans to start working on. I would like to thank in my name for your great remarks, for your participation, and just give back the floor to Zakta so he can conclude this. And I'm very much looking forward to future dialogues, future exchanges with you all. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ilke, and sorry for the questions that we did not get to, but please feel free to forward them to info@seps.eu and we can pass them along to our panelists, and I'm sure they'd be very happy to provide a written response. In the meantime, allow me to thank again Ilke Toyger, Seren Selvin Korkmaz, Sinem Madar, and Evren Balta. Wonderful to see you all. I hope that we'll have further opportunities to collaborate in the months and years ahead. And we all look forward to this Sunday with great anticipation. Thanks again for joining, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.